functional line, when we first started talking about the fascial lines from anatomy trains in class, and if you look in that manual that some of you guys have, you'll notice that we refer to the superficial front line and the front functional line together as one line. And for the longest time, we addressed it like that, but over the last couple years, we've kind of gone away from that and left the superficial front line as its own line, like it's laid out in anatomy trains, and the front functional line like its own line as it's laid out in anatomy trains. And why we started to blur the lines with those two and put them together clinically, and then started teaching them as kind of one little hybrid line, was in all actuality a little bit of a misunderstanding on our part. A lot of times we would see people that would come in with superficial front line issues, and they would also have front functional line issues. And we started to see that repeatedly, and kind of the incorrect logic that we had with that was, well, if you have an issue in one line, you have an issue in the other line, why not just completely treat them the same? And so that's what we started to do. And we were relatively successful with it up to a point, and that point came towards the end of rehabs, specifically upper body rehabs, when we were getting into the phase where we need to now focus in on force production, hypertrophy, power, the umbrella of strength, and lower body when we got to the same thing. Early on, there were a lot of similarities. You know, early on in therapy, when we were doing our tissue quality work, yeah, lines are very blurred. Running through the postures and patterns, we're addressing the superficial front line, we're having to address the front functional line at the same time. But really where the two started to split off from each other was when we got to that last phase of rehab, and we were really working towards goals that revolved around strength, either force production, hypertrophy, power, muscular endurance. So that was one observation that we had. The second, we didn't blur the lines with the superficial back line and the back functional line, even though they're pretty close in proximity to each other. And all the arguments that we made, all the logical jumps that we made with the superficial front line and the front functional line, we can make those same logical arguments and those same logical leaps between the superficial back line and the back functional line. And it would make sense. And it would work right up until we got to that stage where we now are moving beyond posture, pattern stuff, beyond our basic correctives, and moving into that world of force production, hypertrophy, power, and endurance. And once again, we're at a point where we would split. Remember all the stuff I just said? Hips, lateral, functional line, lateral line. We could do the exact same thing there, the simple logic. And that's the problem with simple logic. Doesn't always work. There's usually layers. And when you apply simple logic to a lot of things, oftentimes you're just seeing that top layer from your perspective, and you don't actually perceive all the other intricacies that are going on. And those intricacies were right there in our face the whole time, and we refused to accept them until here very recently, when we started to now separate these out. And the reason why we started to separate these out, again, I mean, it's how it was originally, it's how it's presented by Thomas Myers in anatomy trains. He's never changed that. Why we started to go back to this, and why we started to realize that, you know what, the things that we've been doing and teaching for a while weren't completely wrong, but there's a little bit better way. It comes back to, yes, there's a lot of similarities and crossovers between each one of these lines and one of the cardinal lines, right up until we get to the point of the function of the lines. And the intent and the function of the lines are drastically different. Look the same, look similar, they're right next to each other, but the intent is dramatically different. They're not even in the same ballpark. And so that's a big consideration. when we start, I mean, it's literally in the name of these lines, the functional lines. Now, I hate the term function because nobody knows what function means. Everybody has a definition of function that is what it is. But the intent of the word functional lines, they picked that name for these three lines because these are the lines that allow us to function as people. All the other lines, the cardinal lines, the spiral lines, there's a lot of postural tie-ins and a lot of discussion about their ability to maintain posture over the course of the day. They're very endurance-based, all the way down to their fiber types. None of that's true for these lines. So when we talk about what the lines were designed to do, the cardinal lines, the spiral line, it's all about control. It's all about being able to continue to go and go and go and go and go at a low level all day long to maintain our posture, to allow us as humans to do those endurance-based activities. And we think in our world as athletic trainers, as soon as I say the word endurance-based activities, we're thinking our long-distance runners, our long-distance swimmers, those athletes that go for a long time. That's from a sports standpoint. From a people standpoint, our endurance-based activities are, you're on your feet all day for your job. You're walking, you're moving, you're getting up in the morning, you're doing one thing after another, after another, after another, after another, after another. We don't appreciate the endurance-based conditioning levels that we have to have. I mean, just think of what we do as athletic trainers. There's not a lot of, if we're having to show our explosive capabilities, something went drastically wrong. We're having to run out on the field. We're having to enact an emergency action plan. We hope that doesn't happen. That's not what we do a lot of. The majority of what we do is a lot of low-level stuff that goes on for a long period of time. Remember when I was at Oklahoma State? When I was here at Missouri State, we would, before football practice, before a football game, we would tape. Okay, no big deal. We'd spend 45 minutes taping. I'd tape, I don't remember how many ankles, but whatever. We'd get it done, no big deal. I knew how to tape an ankle. I could tape an ankle before practice. I could tape an ankle before a game. I could do whatever we needed. Not that big of a deal. Went to Oklahoma State. First day of practice, I was like, oh man, this taping thing. Like, man, oh. Then I came to realize my back was sore, my hips were sore, my shoulders were sore, my neck was sore because I was in this position and I was used to taping for 30 to 45 minutes. This was an hour and a half after I started. We went from the volume of athletes here at Missouri State to the volume of athletes at Oklahoma State, and it doubled the time that it took me to do all the taping. What I wasn't prepared for was going from 45 minutes of taping to an hour and a half of taping. The first 3-4 weeks, it was awful. So I gotta stretch the tape. I've gotta, hold on, I gotta get the hot pack set up so I can finish this taping session. Can somebody come stretch me out so I can finish this? The low level endurance I wasn't prepared for. And then also, the taping table was a little bit lower, and as you can tell, I'm a little bit taller. So standing in this position for that long, didn't like it. Over time, I got used to it. Over time, I also figured out a way to raise up the table that I used to tape every day, and that became my table, mainly because nobody else could then reach it, because they were having to tape like this. So it was perfect for me. But the endurance side came. You stand at practice for 14 and a half hours every day. You learn the rotation, especially when the sun's out, so you don't get sunburned on one side and not on the other. That stuff comes, but we get used to that. We build up that low-level endurance. When we're utilizing the low-level endurance, those are the 4 cardinal lines and the spiral line, not the functional lines. When something goes sideways and we have to run out, we have to do something, that's the functional lines. And so because the intent is different, yes, early on in therapy, early on when we're addressing things, there's a lot that's the same. But when it comes to actually restoring the strength, restoring the force production capabilities within the lines, what we have to do is drastically different, because we're talking 2 different intents between this group of lines and the other lines we've talked about so far. So when we talk about the front functional line, you'll also notice these lines are much shorter. There's 3 muscles with this line. How many muscles were there with the spiral line? Like 64. So we have the lower portion of the pec major, rectus abdominis, and the adductor longus. So basically what happens, we go from this shoulder down through the rectus to our opposite hip. So the front functional line and the back functional line cross at the pelvis. Specifically here, with the front functional line, we're crossing over at the pubic symphysis, the pubic tubercle. Goes from the humeral shaft, ribs 5 and 6, where rectus abdominis inserts or originates, whichever way you want to talk about it, cross over the pubic tubercle down into the femur. There's no other tissues associated with this line. We don't have any other random just fascia here, fascia there, no ligaments, nothing else that we need to consider. So this is a very simple line. 3 muscles, 4 boning points, nothing else. Now you notice with the functional lines, we have our superficial front line, abbreviation, and our front arm lines. The front functional line works very intimately with these lines. Essentially what the front functional line does, it helps to connect superficial front line with the front functional line, front arm lines with the front functional line, front arm lines with superficial front line. These lines are about control and endurance. Front functional line is about power and force. So we generate the power and the force, we control and use precision within those lines to direct that force. Talk about back functional line. Once again, only 3 muscles. This time we go from the lats down into the glute max, into the vastus lateralis. Again, we cross over. So lat on the left side, down through the thoracolumbar fascia, or lumbar-dorsal fascia, which is one of the tissues here, through the sacral fascia, into the vastus lateralis on the opposite side. So once again, we cross over. So left shoulder, down through the sacrum to the right vastus lateralis. Again, we have humeral shaft, comes down to the sacrum, to the femur. But then you'll notice we have patella and tibial tuberosity. So we have the patellar tendon as well. So what ends up, this is kind of unique. The back functional line originates on the front side of the shoulder, originates on the front side of the humerus, because the lat comes in and it's on the anterior humerus, and it originates on the anterior side of the tibia. So it originates and inserts, if we use traditional anatomy language, on the anterior side of the body, but all the tissues, the big tissues, on the back side. So we come down from the shoulder all the way to the anterior knee, deep back arm lines, and the superficial front line. So basically from tibial tuberosity on down, it's very heavily associated with the superficial front line. And again, back functional line, front functional line cross over at the pelvis. On the front side is the pubic tubercle, pubic symphysis. On the back side, we're crossing through the sacrum and the sacral fascia. Ipsilateral functional line. Ipsilateral means we're now staying all on one side. This is the only functional line that doesn't cross over. It's in the title. We go lats down to the external obliques into the sartorius. So we go from, once again, the front side of the shoulder on one side, down through the lateral side of the body, and we're attaching where the sartorius attaches down in the pes anserine. Humeral shaft, the end of the floating ribs, through the ASIS, down to the medial tibial condyle pes anserine. Just because of this location, very heavily associated with the lateral line. So with this one, because we're not crossing over, when we're taught, this line is very much involved when we're in single leg stance, again like the lateral line, and then when we're actually hanging off the ground. So when we're actually hanging from like a pull-up bar, hanging from rings, something like that. When our feet are off the ground, this line's involved. Essentially, like I said just a second ago, the functional line essentially acts to extend the arm lines. We're increasing the length of lever arms. We're adding power to all the things that we're trying to do. We're adding force to all the things that we're trying to do with our arms. In anatomy trains, He relates this back a lot to different type of sporting activities, throwing, running, all of that. Anytime we throw anything, it's all about lever arms, and the functional lines allow us to extend the length of those lever arms. This is, like I talked about before when we were talking about the postures. When a kid learns to throw something, they always step and throw with the same arm. They're very much using the ipsilateral functional line with that. We're not crossing over the body. We're not talking about a large force transfer. They're using the momentum of traveling forward to generate that force. They're not using their body to generate any of that force. Now, as that skill of throwing, as the nervous system develops, as the body physically develops, as they now have the desire to need to throw the ball a little bit further or throw the ball a little bit harder, they can't step with the same arm. We need more momentum than we can get just with this forward step, and that's when we start to actually drive through one leg, take a step, generate that dissociation, all to increase the length of our throwing arm so we can get more force into the ball or the object that we're throwing. From a postural standpoint, when we're standing, the functional lines really aren't doing anything. They're kind of dialed off. They're there, but now the cardinal lines, the spiral lines are more involved in helping us stay upright, more so than the functional lines. When we're in a loaded condition, when we pick something up, when we're carrying something, now we've actually activated the functional lines from a stability role, from a control role. But we have to have some kind of outside resistance, some kind of external load, some kind of above body weight load to have the need to engage these tissues, to engage these lines. So now that can be, we pick something up and we carry it. That can also be as soon as we go from walking to running. The running has an increased load because of increased ground reaction forces. When you land from a jump, when you land from a fall, when you step off of something and you land and control yourself, anytime there's above body weight conditions, we're going to need, because of the forces, those cardinal lines are no longer at a point where they can adequately provide the level of control they need. They need assistance. That assistance comes from the better position, better aligned functional lines to help control that. But we're talking above body weight loaded conditions. So anytime you pick anything up, pick your backpacks up, carry it across campus, you're engaging your functional lines just a little bit because you're above body weight. The heavier that backpack goes, the more you're engaging those functional lines. You forget your backpack, it's not the functional lines. We're now leaning on the cardinal lines more and the spiral lines. From a movement standpoint, these lines are perfectly developed, perfectly aligned to create power and to create force. We're talking about large muscles. I mean, we're not talking about the anterior tibialis and talking about how big and thick it is. We're not talking about the ability to create hypertrophy in the pes anserine or in the anterior tibialis. Even if we create a ton of hypertrophy in the anterior tibialis, it's still only going to be about this big in diameter. There's a finite amount that it can grow because of the design of the muscle, because of the fiber type of the muscle, because of the function of the muscle. When you're talking about the pec major, go over to the rec center. It's not Monday. You won't see people working on their pec major because that's International Bench Press Day is Monday. We'll miss out on that, so you won't see people trying to grow their pecs, but we will see people, each one of these muscles are very large muscles. Because of their fiber type, there is a significant potential for hypertrophy and force production within each muscle. Now, just because a muscle's large doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be a strong muscle, but cross-sectional area of muscle and force production of the muscle are intricately tied together. So a bigger muscle in general is going to be a stronger muscle. So if you have small glutes versus large glutes, the large glutes generally are going to generate more force than the smaller glutes. So these muscles the muscles of these lines don't have the limited ability to generate hypertrophy and force like we see in the other areas. Here, we can generate a ton of hypertrophy, which then can carry over to allowing us to increase our amount of force production and power within each one of these muscles. It all goes back to the function of these muscles. It's all about power. It's all about force production. Because of their orientation, they allow us to cross the body. When we start talking about crossing the body, now we're getting into that world of dissociation. Dissociation, the intent of dissociation is to get from here to there. That's our running, our jumping, all that. But also to get from here to there is also our throwing. You know, throw a baseball. I can't get to the back of the room to smack Griffin in the back of the head just because he's the one furthest away from me, but I could throw this to hit Griffin in the head. And I think you guys might not understand how I went from here to there, but Griffin would have a nice little bruise to help me with my argument to show that I was there, but I was here. So throwing is a way for us to also, it's not a technical form of locomotion, but we're moving from here to there with the object. So the functional lines, because of, especially the front functional and the back functional, it allows us to generate force with that dissociation to more quickly and more rapidly get from here to there. Ipsilateral functional line is critical in our development of these skills. It's the first, it's our first line within these that allow us to generate force, because remember, everything we initially learn to do when we throw, when we hit, it's always same arm, same leg. We're engaging that ipsilateral functional line. As that pattern develops, as that strategy develops, it becomes more complex, and then that complexity allows us to cross midline. Remember we talked about the nervous system, keeping everything on the same side, right side doing the same thing as the left side, everything on the right side doing the same thing. It's simpler, it's less complex for the nervous system. As the nervous system develops, as a skill develops, as a strategy develops, as that becomes more, I don't want to say hardwired, but more ingrained, it can handle more complexity, and we start to cross midline a little bit more. When we do that, we move into the front and the back functional lines. Front and back functional lines support the spiral line, again, because of that tie into dissociation, everything we just talked about. Gait, these lines are engaged when we go from walking to jogging, a little bit more of the functional lines, but really when we're talking about our explosive, high speed, high velocity types of gait. And again, that goes back to the intent of what these lines are. Because of what it does with the spiral lines, because of the crossing of the midline with the pubic symphysis at the sacrum, because of its increased involvement as the rate of gait, as the force production with gait increases, there's a lot of spiral rotational dissociation forces that are tied in with these lines. The 4 cardinal lines of spiral lines, we look at the fiber types of those. They're predominantly the type 1 endurance-based fibers. Here we're talking about the type 2 fibers, generate more force. That's also why with these we're not talking endurance. This is why the velocity of gait becomes very important. We can walk for a long time. We're not really engaging these lines. That's an endurance-based activity. You can, if you go and watch Bass Pro Marathon, it was a couple weeks ago, Dogwood Canyon, 25K, 15K, like 1,000K was this past weekend. There's not a lot of power production over the course of that race. We're talking endurance-based fibers. When was the last time you guys saw a cross-country runner that had giant glutes? You don't see it. You tend to see our cross-country, our distance, our endurance-based athletes tend to be a little bit leaner, carry a little bit less muscle mass. When was the last time you saw a sprinter that didn't have glutes? If you want to be a sprinter, you have to generate high amounts of force in a very short period of time to propel yourself down the track faster than your opponent. So because of that, because of the constant training, you see the muscles, you see the body start to reflect that. We see large glutes. When we start talking about velocity, when we move from that jog, that pace that we can go for days at, which from a running standpoint usually is just below your lactate threshold, that's our endurance. That's our cardinal lines, that's a spiral line. Once we move above that lactate threshold, once we move into actually moving quickly, having to sprint out onto the football field, that's our functional lines. Because of the fiber type, because they're the type 2 fibers, when we get to the energy systems, they run out of energy rather quickly. Because of the fiber type. So you can't, you know, 400-meter sprinters train their energy systems to where they can now sprint 400 meters. 800-meter runners, same thing. They train their energy system so they can do that. Milers, they train their energy system so it's a sprint for most of us. It's not a sprint for them. So when we start talking about these fibers, we start talking about the activity that we see is going to be very closely tied into the lines that we're looking at, the lines that we're using. So in the world of athletics, the athletes that we typically deal with that aren't the endurance type athletes, the distance runners, soccer kind of falls into this. Those are the ones where we don't necessarily have a lot of the use of the functional lines. Those athletes where we have a lot of sprinting. Soccer's kind of that hybrid. There's a little bit of it, but they have to go out there and play for like 3.5 hours because they can't score a goal in a game. Everybody else, you have a lot more starting and stopping. Football, you know, if a play goes more than 20 seconds in football, something, you know, we had 3 fumbles and they were just running back and forth. But you're talking very short, explosive plays. Basketball, you get a rebound, you sprint up the court, you have 25 seconds. Ball goes in, and basketball now, every team gets 37 timeouts, so they play for like 30 seconds and you take a 2-minute break. So those sports are more aligned with the use of these functional lines. You go to a track meet, you go to a cross-country race, and 15 minutes. They just go at a constant pace. A marathon, they go at a constant pace. We're not talking these lines. They're not as heavily involved in those lines. So we can look at the activity and get an idea of how influential these lines are going to be for what that person's doing. That factory worker that has to be on their feet all day long, I'm going to consider the functional lines, but I'm really going to be considering the cardinal lines because they're doing the same thing over and over and over and over for 8 hours over the course of the day. So when we take somebody's history, when we talk to somebody when they're having their issues, what issues they're having to do, what they're involved in, we can already start to paint a picture of how involved those functional lines are going to be for what they're having to do versus how involved the cardinal lines and the spiral lines are for what they're having to do, which can kind of help guide us through the rest of our evaluation. There's not a lot of issues within these lines. Just because when we have issues within these lines, it's more than likely going to be an acute type issue because these lines are designed for force and power. If our force need exceeds our force capabilities, then we run into some issues. But you notice we don't see the same type of list of issues that we saw with the other line. We're not going to have a collapsed arch because of these lines. We're not going to have IT band issues, anterior knee pain because of these lines. About the only postural adaptation you're going to see is an increase in rotation where one shoulder is pulled towards the opposite hip. So that can lead to a little bit of presentation of pelvic rotation, trunk rotation, rotated shoulders. If you're thinking back to the shapes, that might be somebody that's in standing. You notice that one of their shoulders rotated a little bit more forward. There might be somebody that in the bottom of the deadlift, you see the shoulders rotated, the pelvis rotated a little bit. And again, and we'll get to that for you guys. And again, I'm not automatically going to think, ooh, that's a back functional line issue. If they tell me, you know, I'm on my feet all day long, I enjoy long distance cycling, I'll go out, I'll ride my bike for 2 hours every night, I'm on my feet all day long, they get into this bottom of deadlift, that background's not leading me to jump right to it's a back functional line issue because I see this rotation. It's leading me towards, that might be a spiral line issue. Because everything they're telling me is about generating a low degree of force for an extended period of time. Now, if this person comes in and they're an Olympic weightlifter, and you know, I'm an Olympic lifter, that's all I do, I train for 4 hours a day, the rest of the day I do what Olympic weightlifters do and I recover, and then I train, and then I recover, and then I train, and then I'll go for like a 3-minute walk to Domino's, and then I recover, and then I train. That person, that same presentation, now I am thinking more functional lines because their activity, what they do is now really heavily in the world of the functional lines. So we can use what they're telling us to help us differentiate and start to figure out which direction we need to consider with this stuff, because there is that close tie. Anytime we have force production issues, movement-based things, this is now a functional line issue. One of the considerations that I have, or one of the expectations, if you're a person and you want to be any level of active, one of the minimal expectations is you have to be able to deadlift your body weight. If somebody can't deadlift their body weight, I'm thinking this is a functional line issue. This isn't a superficial back line issue. This isn't a superficial front line issue. This isn't a spiral line issue. If we're talking force production, you can't generate enough force to pick up your body weight off the ground. This is a functional line issue. If Callan wants to improve his vertical, if his vertical sucked, this is a functional line issue. We're not going to train his spiral line to increase his vertical jump. We're not going to train his superficial back line to increase his vertical jump. We're going after his functional lines. This line, these three lines, front, back, ipsilateral, functional line, these are the only lines that don't have an actual direct tie into the neck. And again, if we look at that, this makes a lot of sense. If I'm trying to generate as much explosive hip extension as I can to jump as high as I can, I don't want my neck tied into that. The neck is a very sensitive structure. We don't want a lot of forces going through the neck. So if I'm generating a high degree of force through my glutes, the biggest, the largest, strongest muscle from a movement standpoint that we can talk about, I don't want my glute firing to have any impact on what's going on my neck. Just because the neck can't, the structure of the neck can't handle those large degrees of forces. That's why when we talk the cardinal lines of spiral line, we want the neck to move as little as possible. The function of those lines is to keep the neck still, to minimize the forces going through the neck. Again, because of the structure of the neck. So we don't want the neck to be tied in with our force production lines. We want those to be separate. I want to be able to generate as much force as I can throwing a ball and not involve my neck as possible. Go back to the kid that ran 80 yards to time the 40. His head was moving. His neck was tied in with everything. That was a giant problem. You have to separate those out. So not tied in with the neck at all. When we talk open chain, upper extremity, when I say open chain, our feet are off the ground. So this is when we're hanging, this is brachiation, this is when we're swimming. The functional lines support what's going on at that point in time with the upper extremity, with the lower extremity. When we think about the cardinal lines, when we think about the spiral line, because of again, if we look at the muscles involved in those lines, there's not a lot of big, strong muscles within those lines. It's all about when our foot hits the ground, directing those forces on their trip up the body. Making sure those forces go to the right places, avoid the right structures, pass from one area to the next appropriately. But it all comes down to when my foot hits the ground. They don't really have the ability to do much when the foot's not engaged with the ground. There are times where we're not going to be engaged with the ground. When we're hanging from something, on a pull-up bar, swimming, we have to have some way of then controlling the shoulder. Creating control, creating stability in the shoulder, creating control, stability in the pelvis, the trunk, and the knee. When our feet are not engaged with the ground, those other lines aren't as efficient at generating the stability and the control that they usually can, because we don't have any ground reaction forces to redirect. So when we're not engaged with the ground, when we're in an open chain type environment, when our feet aren't engaged with the ground, the functional lines become very critical in generating stability and control of the shoulder, of the trunk, of the pelvis, of the knee. Again, because these tissues actually can generate high degrees of forces that the other ones can't. The other lines are all about Our cardinal lines and the spiral lines are all about redirecting forces, making sure those forces go in the same direction, not generating forces. So if we can't redirect forces, we minimize what those lines are capable of doing. Functional lines can generate force on their own. They don't need ground reaction forces. We talk internal rotation of the shoulder. When we look at lower fiber, when we look at the pec comes in and it attaches lateral to the bicipital groove. So our pec comes in, if you find the bicipital groove on your shoulder, your pec comes in and it attaches just lateral to that. When we look at the lats come in, find your bicipital groove, your lats insert on the medial side of the bicipital groove. So your pecs insert where my index finger is, your lats insert where my middle finger is. Because of their insertion point, they both can generate quite a bit of internal rotation force. Now let's think about this. Let's think about what we learned in our undergrad. What's the only rotator cuff muscle that's an internal rotator of the shoulder? You got infraspinatus, supraspinatus, teres, and subscap. Which one's our internal rotator? Subscap. How big is the subscap? Take your scapula, it's about that big. It's about the size of your scapula. And it sits between your scapula and your rib cage. So can't really generate a lot of hypertrophy in there because it's literally wedged between the rib cage and the scapula. It's not a big muscle. So if the subscap played tug of war with the pec major, who's going to win? The pec. Subscap plays tug of war with the lats, who's going to win? The lats. Luckily, the subscap doesn't have to play tug of war with either one of them because all three of them are on the same team. Internal rotation of the shoulder. But by itself, and when we think about the rotator cuff's all about generating control of the shoulder. Subscap's not a strong internal rotator of the shoulder. It can't create a lot of internal rotation forces. It's just too small of a muscle. And the function of the rotator cuff isn't to create force, it's to create control. It's to keep the head of the humerus sucked into the glenoid fossa. So we don't want a lot of internal rotation to come from a subscap. If a rotator cuff goes from being a rotator cuff to being a prime mover, we have problems. Which is one of the reasons why when we talk about exercises, the internal rotation of the shoulder, the external rotation, the banded rotations of the shoulder, all of those are great exercises from a blood flow standpoint. But they're horrible exercises because the rotator cuff doesn't externally rotate the shoulder, even though it can based off of where it originates and where it inserts. The subscap doesn't internally rotate the shoulder. When these muscles fire, remember, these are small muscles. Small muscles, it's not about force, it's about when they turn on and when they turn off. And it's keeping the head of the humerus where it needs to be so that the bigger, larger, stronger muscles can do the things that they're designed to do, which is bigger, larger, stronger forces. So the subscap is all about keeping the head of the humerus where it needs to be so the big, strong internal rotators can do internal rotation. And when we think about internal rotation is all about taking something from here and pulling it to us. It's about taking this and throwing it there. So when we think about our force production, about pulling things to us, our internal rotators are a lot stronger than our external rotators. Hence the lats and the pecs. Two very large, very strong muscles that can generate a lot of internal rotation forces. In football, look, in any sport, shoulder dislocations. Do we see anterior dislocations or posterior dislocations more frequently? How many of you guys have seen an anterior shoulder dislocation? Shoulder pops out, sits right here. How many of you guys have seen a posterior shoulder dislocation? We see more anterior dislocations than we do posterior dislocations. One is because of the anatomy of the shoulder. Two is the mechanism. We see most of our anterior dislocations when my arm's out here and I'm trying to either grab somebody as they run by, or I have my arm out here and I get a high degree of force through this and it levers the humeral head out. Where's my arm? It's way out here. My internal rotators are trying to pull it back here. We have very large, strong muscles to prevent the shoulder from dislocating when our hand gets out in this direction, so that we can then pull things in towards us. Now, sometimes because of the leverage and the forces and what all's going on at the shoulder, they're not able to control that. But we have very large, very strong internal rotators for a reason. Pec major, lat are our two biggest with that. Functional lines connect the arm to the shoulder. Again, when we talk about right arm to right leg, it's all through the ipsilateral line. We're connecting left shoulder to left knee, specifically the medial side of the left knee, right shoulder to right knee. Deep back arm lines, superficial front arm lines are very intricately tied in with this line because through the bicipital groove and the humerus. So again, when we think about these lines and their ability to extend the arm lines, we now are starting to talk about a connection between this shoulder and this knee. That's that person that comes in that has medial knee pain, that we come back and we trace it all the way up to a biceps issue. We address the biceps and their medial knee pain goes away. Not because there's an actual direct fascial link, but we have our front arm line that's connected to the ipsilateral functional line that takes us all the way down to the knee. We think about, well, how does that make any sense? When we think about what the function of the line is to extend the arm lines, increase the force through the arm lines, now we start to see that connection from a functional standpoint. That's why it only hurts when I go out for a run. It doesn't bother me when I'm doing anything else, I just notice it when I'm running, because now we're starting to talk higher levels of force. When we start talking contralateral, so right shoulder to left leg, left shoulder to right leg, back functional line, we're coming from the front side of the shoulder down to the lat. We loop around through the back, through the posterior side, through the fascia, the sacral fascia, through the glute, into the vastus lateralis. Remember when we talked about vastus lateralis and its influence in the IT band? It's the fourth component of the IT band. Not a part of the IT band, but sits underneath and supports the IT band. And then at the bottom side, it connects all the way down into the superficial front line, deep back arm line, superficial front arm lines up in the shoulder because of their insertion points. Front functional line, we track that path through the lower portions of the pec, through the lateral portions of the rectus, down in across the pubic symphysis, and we're going into the medial femur. Doesn't really have a lot of carryover beyond that into other lines, but we do have our tie-in into the front and the back arm lines up at the shoulder. So depending on what's going on, if there's something going on in the arms, it can either take us down on the same side to the medial knee, it can take us down to the opposite side on the lateral knee, or it can take us down to the opposite side mid-femur. So those are our three anchor points essentially for our arm, especially when we're throwing things. That's also why swimmers, what's going on in the lower extremity can have a lot of influence on the shoulders. Oftentimes when we think of swimmers, we think about we've got to have shoulder health. We got to do all these things to protect the shoulder. With our throwing athletes, we got to do all this stuff to protect the shoulder. That's not wrong, and I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just a very myopic view. It's because when we think about the shoulder, what's going to generate more force? The subscap or the pecs? The pecs. Now, okay, yeah, Brandon, but the pecs are still just part of the shoulder. Correct. But they also tie into the rectus, and then they tie into the adductors. And if there's something going on here, it's going to change the force production ability of the pec. If the pec can't do the job that the pec needs to do, then the subscap's going to think, it's my time to shine, I'm going to try and help, and it's going to literally step into waters that it's not prepared for. And we're going to run into shoulder issues. And then we're not going to understand why these shoulder exercises, why our shoulder interventions aren't helping, because it's an issue down on the other side, on the opposite lower extremity. So we have to understand, sometimes we have a shoulder issue, it's an actual shoulder issue. Sometimes those basic shoulder exercises that we do fix the situation. That's wonderful. But if they don't fix the situation, doing it more, exposing it more, isn't going to fix the situation. If our local interventions aren't working, we need to consider, okay, where else can this be coming from? We need to look to the opposite lower limb. We need to look to the same side lower limb. We have to have that ability to understand that, okay, if my interventions aren't working, it's one of two problems. I'm doing the wrong things and my skill set is horrible, or this is coming from somewhere else. So when you have the ability to start local. If it works, wonderful. If it doesn't work, then we need to start to expand our thinking. We need to, okay, where else is this coming from? What else can be contributing to this? If it's a throwing athlete, what I'm doing on the throwing shoulder doesn't work, then after a couple of visits, I'm automatically considering that lead leg. What's going on in that lead leg? Because what they do with this leg when it hits the ground can have a huge impact on what's going on with the shoulder through either the front functional line or the back functional line, and also the spiral line. So if my local interventions aren't working, I'm not just going to continue to do those things and hope that they fix it, because they haven't. I need to expand my thought process and look to the opposite side of it. From a postural tie-in, because of the rotation, the dissociation component, it's the exact same as the spiral line. We really start to see it develop in quadruped, progressing up into sitting, kneeling, and stance. These are our force production lines. These are the lines that allow us to not get into quadruped and just hang out in quadruped. This is what allows us to get into quadruped and actually grab something and pull it towards us. This is what allows us in sitting and kneeling to grab something and pull it towards us. This is what allows us when we stand up and we pick up an object, pick up a toy and carry it, we're now engaging the functional lines. So as the rate of, when we first get into quadruped, we're using our spiral lines. As we start to initiate crawling, we're using our spiral lines. As that velocity of crawling increases, now we're really starting to engage those functional lines. Our ability to get up, maintain our hands into the ground, push up, that's all about the functional lines. From an injury standpoint, like I said before, we don't see a lot of overuse type things here because these aren't overused muscles. These are force production muscles. One of the things that didn't exist a few years ago were oblique strains. Now all of a sudden, oblique strains are the norm. So you have to wonder why all of a sudden are oblique strains the norm. We didn't just randomly develop new muscles. We didn't just change the type of muscles, but all of a sudden we start seeing these oblique strains, especially in throwers. Really, we see this in baseball. And when we see an oblique strain, external oblique, internal oblique, these muscles, yes, they are, when we talk, ipsilateral functional line, the external obliques are involved in the ipsilateral functional line. But when we're talking about ipsilateral functional line, do our forces cross midline? No. It's all about, it's low level skill. Same arm, same leg. We're not using the obliques to generate rotational forces. We're still staying very linear. When we look at back functional line, We don't use the obliques to generate any of that rotation, that dissociation force. That's coming from the glutes. And we're transmitting it up through the sacrum, through the lats to the shoulder. When we talk front functional line, adductors, because of their size, because of where they're located, they can generate a lot of force. Pecs can generate a lot of force. We're not engaging the external obliques. So we're not engaging the external obliques when we're using the front functional line. So the two lines that cross midline that are best designed and best positioned to generate those dissociation forces don't engage the obliques. So why are we seeing all of these oblique strains? And it goes back to the fact the obliques aren't designed to generate force in rotation, in dissociation. They're part of the spiral line, which means it's all about directing and controlling the force. So the obliques are designed and utilized to control and direct force, not generate force. So we're seeing all of these oblique strains. When we see an oblique strain, it's 100% a training error. We are training the obliques to do something that they're not designed to do. That would be the same as if we were trying to train the subscap to be a giant internal rotator of the shoulder. Can we? Yes, we can. Will it lead to problems? Yes, it will. Because that's not what the muscle is designed for. That's not the fiber typing of the muscle. That's not the functional application of the muscle. We can do a lot of things, but there's going to be consequences. And we start talking about isolating the obliques. And how do we isolate the obliques? Anytime we sit down and we start talking about this type of rotation, we're isolating the obliques. The glutes can't generate rotational forces, dissociation forces. The adductors can't generate dissociation, rotation forces. These forces are coming from our oblique. If you go over to the rec center, there's going to be a machine somewhere. It's designed, I don't know exactly how it's going to be designed, but you're going to either lock in with the shoulders here and you rotate and you work your obliques. If you go away from the machine, then what it turns into is I'm now on my feet generating lots of rotation forces. And you can say, well, yeah, that's what we do with throwing. Correct. But it all depends on what we do with our feet. So all these people that have oblique strains, they're either sitting down and generating rotation, or they're putting their feet in an orientation that's symmetrical and generating rotation. The feet aren't designed to be symmetrical and generate dissociation. Remember, dissociation is tied with asymmetry. Now, if I'm trying to generate forces going this way, I can engage my right glute to generate a lot of forces. I'm then going to engage my obliques through the spiral line to help control and redirect that until my shoulder goes that way. That's called throwing. I'm using, from a throwing standpoint, I'm using my right glute to generate forces going this way. I want to get those forces into my right arm. I'm going to have to rotate, so we're going through ipsilateral line. We're then going through back functional line, and we're ultimately throwing the ball that way. But it's all, the dissociation forces are all coming from my right lower extremity, not my external obliques. So when we see these, when we see an oblique strain, it's a training error. We have trained that muscle to think it's a generator of force when it's not. 100% a training error. If you look at when we started to see these oblique strains start to come into play, we also at the same time started seeing people lock their feet in and start throwing things at the ball. We have all these different types of things where we're generating forces. There's this one ball, it's on a string, and you stand with your back to the ball, and you smack the ball into the wall, and when you smack, it's a rubber ball, so it bounces off, and you're going back and forth like this, you will feel a crazy burn in your obliques. Just because you feel a burn doesn't mean you're actually doing anything. Because you're training the obliques to generate rotation. Because your feet are locked in, you can't engage the glutes, you can't engage the adductors. You're training the obliques to be a prime mover, and they're not. How do we change this? Well, we change our stance. Then we can't use this ball anymore. And that's perfectly fine, because we shouldn't be locked into a training methodology just because of the implement. There's lots of ways to generate force without using an implement like that. So we have to understand, we see an oblique strain, first consideration has to be, it's a training problem. The solution is going to be going back and figuring out what that training problem is and removing it. And then we have to retrain that oblique to actually be an oblique and not be a prime mover. We can run into issues with the sacrum, we can run into issues with the ASIS because of the bony attachments. You can have your actual strains of the muscle, but we're not going to run into many of the overuse type tie-ins because these aren't overuse type muscles. These aren't overuse type tissues. These are force production type tissues. So we're going to see more of our acute type injuries. All right. Any question on the functional lines? That is all I have then. It's a shorter day because there's not a lot to talk about with the functional lines, because the functional lines are short, sweet, and to the point. They generate force. They support the other lines. Not a lot of injury stuff to talk about. They're pretty straightforward. If you don't have any questions, we'll be back on Thursday.